4 years ago, I began checking something off my bucket list that had probably been on there since most of you freshmen, like before. I think that may be me. Check, check, 1, 2. Let's try that again. I'm a hand talker, so this is really going to be stretching me. 4 years ago, I began checking something off my bucket list that had been there since most of you freshmen were not even alive, okay? I started training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, okay? And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I know that, don't cheer, it's scary. I know that a lot of you don't have a context for that, and so I like to describe it. It's a martial art, but there's no strikes, there's no hitting. It's really like really aggressive cuddling is really what it is. And so essentially, what we do is we go to the gym, and you get partnered up with a random person, and basically we'll drill and practice some movements and submissions and sweeps. And then after that, we literally, one of the things different about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is at the end of class, for the last 20, 15 minutes, we fight each other. Like full-on fight. Like you can't hit, you can't strike. We basically like start standing and we're trying to like take our opponent to the ground with a takedown or whatever, a pull guard. And then we try to apply submissions. We're trying to block airflow and blood flow from their brain until they tap through chokes. Or we try to bend their arms and legs and contort their body in such a painful way that they tap because they don't want it to continue. It's a lovely sport. Jesus just loves it. So in the beginning, when I first started summer 2020, man, I was so nervous. Like, I don't know if I've ever been more nervous in my life than those first couple months going to the gym because I was terrified. I mean, I was scared. I'm claustrophobic. It's awkward. I knew that, like, you have to get really comfortable with other people's bodies being up in your body, like, to the point that, like, I have had other people's sweat and blood on me. I have pulled other people's hair out of my mouth. I have had a select few of 3 dudes named Jacob, John, and Nima. I have had their sweat fall off their faces into my mouth, okay? It's awkward. You got to get really, really, really comfortable with other people's bodies. And so I was really nervous, and it was like 2 weeks into me doing this. It was probably like my 5th or 6th class, and I showed up to a night class, and I ended up getting partnered up with this high school kid named Jackson. Okay, Jackson was like 6'20", and he weighed like 83 pounds. So you know the type, like the type that like they turn sideways and they disappear. You can't even see him, right? And then Jackson gets stuck with the chubby geriatric. I weighed like 20 pounds more than I do right now. And we had to train and drill together, and then we were going to spar for the first 5-minute round at the end of class. And so that night we were learning leg triangles. I really thought about bringing some high school boy up here and showing you, but number one, nobody wants to listen to me trying to survive and breathe hard. Number two, gravity and my chubbiness might break some poor boy Twig's arm. So this is a leg triangle. I got a picture for you, okay? And basically what's going on here is the person in the bottom is in control, and on one side, he has his leg against his opponent's carotid artery on this side, and on the other side, his opponent's shoulder and arm is blocking the other artery and getting pressure from the leg. And if you're really good at it, which I'm not, because I have like short little bridge troll legs, and I'm not flexy and bendy, but if you're really good at it, within like 3 to 6 seconds, your opponent will tap her. You could basically choke them out, right? And so we're learning this. I've seen these on MMA and UFC, but I've never like learned how to do them. And so we're practicing, and you do it to submission. Like your opponent is supposed to do it to you until you tap because you can't breathe anymore, right? And so he would do it, and I would do it, and he would do it. And we had done it like 3 or 4 times, and it's my turn, and there's process to this. There's steps, right? So he's in my guard. My legs are crossed. I'm going to break my guard, and I'm going to switch my hips, and I'm going to throw my leg over his arm and break his grip. And I'm going to put my foot on the other hip and shoot my hips up in the air and throw my leg over his head and lock my ankles and grab my shin, and I'm going to elevate my hips and move his arm over so that it's choking him, and then I'm going to squeeze, right, and pull his head down. There's a process to this, and I'm doing this to Jackson. Twiggy, 83-pound Jackson. And at the end, I like elevate my hips, and I'm starting to lock it in. And I had a moment, okay? And for you to understand this moment, I need you to look at that picture, and I need you to look at the proximity of the person on bottom's buttocks to the other person's throat, okay? And I'm on the bottom, and I elevate my hips, and I'm moving the arm to lock this in, and I had a moment that I will call a lack of sphincter control, okay? And I tooted. And toot doesn't even, like, describe what happened. It was a really airy, like, 2-second long. Have you ever seen, like, a cruise ship, like, leaving the bay, and it's like, oh, like, 2 seconds of that. And so I'm elevating my hips and moving his arm, and it's like, oh, and I never forget. His head, like, looks up, and I watch his eyes get really big. And I dropped my guard, and I dropped the submission, and before I could even say I'm sorry, he says to me, and I quote, "I felt that in my throat." And I was like, "Bro, I'm so sorry." And in that moment, this moment of embarrassment and shame, this moment, my response was I literally wanted to run away and crawl in a hole and die. As an adult, I have no shame. I have no pride. I will tell you all my embarrassing stories. I'm literally telling you right now how I rattled this kid's esophagus with my flatulence. I have no shame. But because I was so new and so nervous, like when his eyes got big and he said, "I felt that," I wanted to put as much distance between me and Jackson as possible, and I wanted to never see this kid again because I knew, like, he's never going to want to do anything with me ever again. Like, after I rattled his esophagus with my flatulence, he is never going to want to do anything with me again, right? And that response, the response of, I have wronged this child, and I want to put as much distance as I can between myself and him, and I want to never see him again. That is our natural response in life when we wrong another human. And when I say wrong, I mean like really wrong. I'm not talking about like, oh, you tooted on a kid's throat. I mean like I have betrayed this friend. I have used my words in such a way that I've harmed this person that I'm connected to. I have used my words and my actions to bully and belittle this person and beat them down, to elevate myself in the eyes of others. Like I've been someone you can't trust. I've been a slanderer, a gossip. In this life, when we wrong another human being, our natural response is the exact same thing that I wanted to do with Jackson. Is when we truly wrong them, and we know that we've wronged them. Our first response is, number one, shame and guilt. We pick up our shame shovel, and we just start, oh, man, I can't believe I did that. The next thing is we want to put as much distance as we don't want to see that person. We don't want to run into them. We don't want to be in a place where they may show up because we know that we've wronged them. And the third thing is we think in our brain, that human is never going to want to do anything with me again because of what I've done. They're not going to want to have anything to do with me. And that response right there on a deeper level is exactly what we do when we mess up our relationship with God. That when we get caught up in sin, we get caught up in wrongdoing, whatever that may be, it may be that we're hanging out with that crowd that we probably shouldn't be hanging out with, but we really want to be accepted so much in this social scene over here that we're willing to compromise what we know God wants us to do and how he wants us to live. But we want to belong so much with this crowd in the social scene that we conduct ourselves in a way that dishonors God. And we do this repeatedly, and we know it. Or maybe you're in that romantic relationship with that significant other, and your desire to be loved and wanted supersedes your desire to honor Christ, and that person maybe leads you to do and say things that you shouldn't. Or maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's something that you can't put down. Maybe it's something that you look at and you know you shouldn't, and you tell yourself you're never going to do that again, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you just can't help but continuing to run back. As Scripture says, like a dog returns to its vomit, you continue to return to that addiction or those images or whatever it is that you cannot put down. And I could just keep going on and on about how we bully and pick on each other. Just fill in the blank. I work with students. I know you, okay? But when we're in a position where we feel like we are sinning and we are failing God and we feel like we are hurting and damaging and fracturing our relationship with him, our response is exactly what my response was with Jackson. It's exactly what our response wants to be with other humans. Our response toward God is this. Let me pick up my shame shovel because God must be so mad at me. He must be so disappointed. Man, I bet he's just so ashamed that I even bear his name. And we pick up our shame shovel and we just heap it on us by the ton. And then we put distance between us and God. We don't want to be at church or youth group. We don't want to be in places where God's presence and his word and his people are because that just induces further guilt. And so we avoid those places. Some of you, though, stay in those places and you go through the motions. And on the outside, it looks like you're killing it. But on the inside, you're pushing God away. And he's so distant. I've been there. But we start heaping shame and guilt, and we put as much distance as we can between us and God as possible, and we think to ourselves, there is no way he's going to want anything to do with me. There's no way that he could ever want to use me because of what I've done and where I've been and how I've acted and what I've said and how I've behaved and how I've dishonored him. We think to ourselves, there's no way he would ever want anything to do with me for his kingdom or his church. He's probably so mad and so ashamed. And here's the truth tonight. The truth is that in the midst of your awful, dark-hearted, failing, dropping the ball, screwing up, sinning, first of all, he knew. He knew about it before you ever conceived it. But you know what? He died for you anyway because he loves you. And what he wants more than anything is you to stop working so hard to stay away from him and stop working so hard to bury yourself in shame and guilt. And he wants you to come and rest in his love. We just sang that song, but do you believe it? He wants you to rest in his love. And why does he need you to rest, right? Because he wants you to stockpile your energy because he wants to use you. He has a purpose for you. He has a kingdom purpose for you. He wants you to do kingdom work. He wants you, even in the midst of your sin, even in the midst of your struggles, even in the midst of you thinking like you're so full of sin and so fallen, there's no way that he could ever want to use you. He wants you to come back, rest in him, and feed his sheep. And that is exactly what we see going on in the life of this knuckleheaded, brash ADHD freshman boy that I resonate so much with named Simon Peter. And here's the thing about Simon Peter. We're going to dive into a story, right? And we're going to spend and read some verses mostly over here in part 3 of Simon Peter's story. And what you're going to see over here is you're going to see a conversation that happens in the midst of his greatest failure. But before we can jump into part 3, we got a helicopter fly over part 2, and we got a helicopter fly over part 1 so that we can understand what's going on, okay? So let's jump over here. Helicopter fly over part number 1. John chapter 13. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, one of his followers, he's actually one of Jesus' 2 closest homeboys, right? Him and John and Jesus are like that, right? Told you I'm a hand talker. And Jesus has not been arrested, and he's not been beaten and flogged and crucified. He's not done that yet. He's in this room with his disciples, and they're sharing this holy supper called Passover. And it's kind of like the last hoorah with his boys, right? They're going to share this meal. He's going to teach them a little bit. He's going to pray over them, and then they're going to leave, and he's going to go get arrested. And they're in this room, and while they're in this room, Jesus is predicting his death to them. And Peter's there, right? And Jesus says, guys, I'm leaving. And where I'm going, you can't follow. And Peter, remember, brash freshman boy, right? Speaks before thinking and ends up tasting the back of his knee because he gets his foot in his mouth so far. I mean, this is the guy that literally jumped out of the boat and wanted to walk on water and then sank. This is the guy that literally in a few seconds is going to try to chop a dude's head off to prevent Jesus from getting arrested. Dude, he's a freshman boy at heart, right? I love this guy. I resonate with that, right? And Jesus is like, where I'm going, you can't go. You can't follow. And Peter's like, what? Lord, where are you going that we can't follow you? And Jesus explains again. And they don't get it because he's predicting his death, and they don't fully understand. And Peter says, Lord, I will follow you anywhere. And then he says, I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus looks at him and says, before the rooster crows, which is literally next morning, you're going to deny that you even know me 3 times, Peter. And so you fast forward a little bit. They leave that dinner, and over here in part 2, Jesus goes to the garden, and he gets arrested. Peter tries to chop a dude's head off and only gets his ear, and Jesus is like, oh, ninja powers, and fixes it. And then he gets hauled off, and he goes to this place where he goes through some trials, right, in part 2 of Peter's story, where the Jews want Jesus dead. They don't have the authority to do it. And so they're passing Jesus to the Romans, but they don't want to kill Jesus because a lot of people like him, a lot of people don't. And so he just goes back and forth in these 6 trials, right? And in the midst of these trials, the cool thing is, one of Jesus' closest homies, Peter and John, but John is known to the high priest. And so John gets secret access, he gets past the bouncers in the club, right? And he brings Peter with him. And so they go to the trials in part 2 of Peter's story in John chapter 18. And Peter's waiting outside for John to get him in. And while he's waiting outside, a servant girl, a slave child female, she is literally the lowest on the totem pole in their society. She sees Peter standing there, and she's like, hey, aren't you one of that guy's followers? I think you are. And he's like, no, I'm not. I don't know him. And then John gets Peter access, and he goes into the room, and Jesus is being tried and spit on and hit and mocked over here. And they've built a fire, and they're warming themselves, right? And as they're sitting around the fire warming themselves, someone there looks at Peter and goes, dude, aren't you one of his followers, right? I think I've seen you with him. And Peter's like, no, I'm not. And a little bit later, ironically enough, the cousin of the dude who Peter tried to chop his head off and Jesus had to heal his ear, this cousin is sitting there around the fire. And he was at the garden when Jesus gets arrested a little while before. And he looks at Peter and he's like, hey, I saw you in the garden. I saw you there, right? Aren't you one of his followers? And Peter's like, I'm not, right? The other gospel writers give us more detail. He is calling down curses on himself. Like, I don't know this man. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not one of his followers. And when he makes that third denial to a slave girl, to a person at the fire, to the cousin of the dude he tried to kill because of Jesus, when he makes that third denial, two things happen. One, Luke tells us that Jesus is off a little bit away, and when Peter denies him the third time, Jesus makes eye contact with him. He looks at him and locks eyes. And it's like he's saying, like, I knew this was going to happen. And then the rooster crows, and Peter runs, right? He runs away. He flees. Luke tells us he weeps bitterly as he runs out into the night, right? And not only does homie just run, like he doesn't show up. He has just abandoned Jesus at his trials while Jesus is being questioned and flogged and interrogated. He doesn't show up when Jesus is being beaten and flogged a little while later. He doesn't even show up at the crucifixion. In Jesus' greatest time of need, one of his two closest followers, John, shows up. Peter's nowhere to be found. And where is Peter? He's gone back to his old life. He goes back to fishing. And why is that? Because in his opinion, he has absolutely wrecked his relationship with Jesus. He has absolutely savagely shattered his relationship with Jesus. And I know you're sitting here thinking like, hey, I mean, he just lied a couple times. Like, I lied like 27 times today. Well, yeah, you probably did. But it's a lot deeper than that, okay? And let me flesh this out for you so you can understand. As we talked about earlier, I am a married man, and I know that may surprise a lot of you, okay? But she's doing Jesus a solid by putting up with me, okay? And I wasn't always chubby and bald. I used to be chubby with hair. Okay, so just cut me some slack, right? But I'm a married man. My wife is Kelsey Noel, and oh my gosh, she's like my best friend, and she's a walking ball of anxiety and can't make any decisions, and I love her to pieces. She's beautiful inside out, so loyal, right? I want you to pretend that my wife and I go to a social setting. Now, here's how we know we're pretending is because we're both introverts, and we would never choose to do that, okay? But we go to a social setting, and she's over there by the charcuterie board talking to people, eating some snacks, and I'm over here talking to a circle of people, and while we're sitting there, this beautiful woman walks up and just starts talking to me, right? I mean, we're pretending. We know that this would never happen, okay? But she talks up, she's flirting a little bit, right? And I'm picking up what she's laying down. I start slipping the ring off. I start laying it back like I'm Harry Potter, the boy who rizzed, and I'm like flirting back, and we're talking, right? And one of my friends sees me slip off the ring, sees me flirting and talking to this lady, and they're like, Tibbitt, what are you doing? You're married. Your wife is over there next to the charcuterie board. Like, what are you doing, right? And I'm like, dude, I'm not married. I don't even know that girl. What are you talking about, right? And I keep flirting, hey, what's up, girl? And we're exchanging numbers, and somebody walks up, and they're like, bro, what are you doing, Tibbitt? You are married. Your wife is literally over there across the room. Like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm not married. I don't know what you're talking about. If I denied in this setting that I didn't even know my wife 2-3 times, right? For what? A moment of satisfaction? Getting flirted with this lady, potentially getting a number, whatever. If I denied I knew my wife 3 times, when I faced her at home that night, I'm going to have a way bigger mess to deal with than just like, hey, sorry I lied today. Like a huge mess. I mean, I have just pretended as if the vows I made before friends, family, and God on December 13, 2003 never happened. To death, I denied that. I'm pretending like the 20 years we celebrated last December of marriage, the life that we've built, the friendship that we fostered, our 2 children, right? The farm that we live on, the life that we have in the community of the church that we love. I am pretending as if none of that ever happened and none of that ever mattered for a moment of what? Being flirted with, laying down some game, being a grizzly bear? I don't know. And when I get home and face her, I'm going to have a whole lot more to deal with than just a couple white lies, right? Like, I'll be lucky if she doesn't shank me prison style in my sleep, all right? Now, jump back to Peter. He hasn't just lied. He's acted as if the 3 years where he has walked with Jesus daily, and traveled around with him and lived with him daily didn't happen. He's acting as if the miracles that he saw, the 5,000 people plus being fed from a small boy's lunch, the lame being able to walk for the first time, the blind receiving their sight, right? He's pretending as if watching Lazarus and the little girl be resurrected from the mother-loving dead didn't happen. He's acting as if the kingdom that Jesus has given them an insight to, this kingdom of love and kindness and compassion, right? This new thing, he's acting as if he never saw it. I don't even know this man. What are you talking about? I mean, he's really, really failed hardcore, fractured his relationship with Jesus. And that's why in that moment when Jesus looks at him, I knew this was going to happen, that he flees and he weeps bitterly and he doesn't show back up. He runs off and abandons Jesus in his time of need, and he goes back to his old life. And so we pick up part 3 of his story. In part 3 of Peter's story, we find him fishing. He's in a boat with a couple other disciples. And I just want to stop here and just say, is that not so true of us that when we really get caught up in sin and we think that God's really mad at us, that we go back to what we knew? The old friends, the old environments, the old crowds. He goes back to fishing, and they're in the boat, and they're about a football field away from the shore. And they hadn't caught anything, right? And in John chapter 21, there's a stranger on the shore. It's like, friends, have you caught anything? Caught anything? Caught it? And they're like, no. Well, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. And they're like, eye roll. What does this dude know? And they throw their nets on the other side. And their nets are bursting. They can't even haul them in. Luke says 153 fish. And when this happens, they look at each other. They're like, this is some Jesus stuff. He's always messing with us like this. And they're like, it's the Lord. And they realize, like, this stranger, dude, it's Jesus. And Peter does the most junior high boy thing ever, right? I mean, he's the guy that, like, if I'm at camp and I'm like, who will eat this box of nails for a free concession stand? You know, he's in the boat, and he realizes it's Jesus, and he'd been fishing without his robe on. He's literally kind of in his under wrapping and maybe a tunic, a shirt. He's kind of half naked, and he's going to jump in the water and swim back to shore, but before he does it, he puts his robe back on. I'd be like, one of y'all like, oh, man, I got to swim to go see Jesus. So let me put my Nike socks and my Crocs back on before I jump in the water, right? He's just not thinking. But he jumps in, and he swims to shore. The other disciples get there in a boat, and Jesus has been making breakfast, and they eat, and they're around this campfire. And then this conversation happens. You ready? And in this moment, I'm going to frame it for you. It's part 3 of his story, John chapter 21. He has heaped so much shame and guilt on himself. He has ruled himself out from being used and having a purpose in Jesus' kingdom because of his failure and because of his sin. And yet Jesus has sought him out, fed him some breakfast, and they're sitting there, and this conversation happens. John 21, verse 15. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, take that name right there, file it away, put it in your back pocket. We're going to bring that back out. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? There's a lot of conversation. What are the these that Jesus is talking about, right? Is he talking about the other disciples? Like, hey, do you love me more than these dudes love me? I think he's talking about fishing tackle. Hey, Simon, do you love me more than this old life that you ran back to? Do you love me more than boats and fish and nets? Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. And then he predicts the way he's going to die, and he ends this conversation with Peter about his denials by just saying, follow me, right? And here's the deal. When you read this in English, we're about to nerd out. Okay, so put our glasses up, all right? Here we go. Because if I don't mention this, you're going to get to youth group time. Your youth minister will be like, I can't believe he didn't mention the Greek word. So get my expo marker out. So we got to cover this, okay? If you read this in English, it's kind of like black and white. And if you kind of dig into the original language Greek, you kind of find some color, okay? Because what's going on is Jesus and Peter are not using the same words for love throughout most of this conversation. Greek had like 6 or 7 different words for love. There's like 2 or 3 main ones that get used in Scripture. The main one being used here is agape love. It's kind of like the unending, selfless, like God kind of love, right? And the other one is phileo or philos love. It's a brotherly, familial, chosen, social love, right? It's where we get our word for Philadelphia, the city of philos, brotherly love, right? And so in here, Jesus asked him 2 times, Peter, do you agape me? Do you unendingly, dedicatedly, selflessly love me? And those first 2 times, Peter responds, Lord, you know that I phileo you. I love you like a brother. And then the 3rd time, Jesus says, Simon Peter, do you love me? Phileo love me? And it says Peter was hurt. And he responded, Lord, you know that I phileo love you, right? And here's the deal. A lot of people have tried to make a lot of those words, those synonyms for love that get used. And I'm not a Bible scholar. Do I think there's something there? Yeah, I think Peter's reaction tells you that there's something going on there, right? But you know what I think is more important than the synonyms for love that get used here? You know what I think is more definitive? Is the fact that Jesus asked him, do you love me 3 times? Which is equal to the number of times that Peter denied that he even knew Jesus. And why that's significant is because I think that Jesus is saying the same thing to Peter with this conversation that he said to him when he looked at him across the room as he was being interrogated, and Peter denied him for the 3rd time. I think Jesus is saying to him, I knew this was going to happen. I told you it was going to happen. And I don't think that Jesus is saying to him like, I told you so, you piece of filth. Like, you have totally let me down, and you should be ashamed. Give me 20 burpees. Like, I don't think that that's what Jesus is saying here. I think he's saying to him, I'm not reminding you, Simon Peter, of your failure. I'm reminding you of the fact that I knew it was going to happen before it happened. And here's what tells me that. What name does he call him? Simon. Let me give you a 4-hour word study I did and save you a bunch of time because I love to nerd out on this stuff. But, man, you need to know that Simon had 2 names. His birth name was Simon, but later on Jesus changed his name to Petros or Peter, which means rock, right? And what you need to know is the Gospels in Jesus almost exclusively call this guy Simon Peter or Peter. They very rarely, if ever, call him by his birth name. It happens like 4 or 5 times, right? One of them is when he was just Simon and he's called to follow Jesus and he didn't even have the name Peter yet. And Jesus said, hey, Simon, come follow me, right? Another time is when Peter makes this great confession where, Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, whoa, Simon, he uses his birth name. Man, this confession you just made, this is the rock on which I'm going to build my church. And from here on out, you're going to be called Petros, rock, because of this confession, right? So Jesus uses his birth name 2 times in kind of good ways. When he calls him and when Peter makes his confession. You know what the other 3 times are? It's when he's failing. Back in part 1 in the upper room, when Jesus predicts Peter's denials, right before that, as Jesus is coming in the room, Peter and a few of the disciples are arguing about who's going to be the most important in Jesus' kingdom when he comes to rule. And they're arguing about who's going to be the most big of a deal and most powerful and have the most influence. And Jesus comes in and he's like, Simon, man, this is how the lords of the earth and kings of the earth lord over you and handle themselves. Like, that's not how I want you to be. I want you to be a servant of all, right? And then you got this time. Simon. I don't think he's doing what my mom used to do and being like, Matthew Dale, I'm so disappointed. I think Jesus is getting down on his child's level and he's saying to him, Simon, son of John, I'm going to ask you 3 times if you love me because I want to remind you that I knew you were going to fail. I knew it. And you know what? You did. But guess what, Simon? I died for you anyway because I love you. That while you were running away and you didn't even show up at my crucifixion, when I probably needed your comfort and your encouragement the most, when you bailed on me in my trials and the flogging, when you didn't even show your face and you went back to your old life thinking that there's no way that Jesus could ever use me in his kingdom, and you went back to fishing, that in the midst of that, I knew all that was going to happen, and guess what? I went to the cross anyway to die for you. That's where I was leaving to go to that you couldn't follow. because I love you. And I think that what Jesus is saying to him through this conversation is, I knew, but I died anyway. And I need you to stop working so hard to bury yourself in shame and guilt, thinking that I must be so disappointed and mad and just hate you, and that there's no way that I could use you and give you a purpose in my kingdom. Stop that. Stop working so hard to run away from me. And here's what I need from you, Simon. Are you ready? I need you to rest in my love. Take confidence and rest in the fact that I died for you anyway, knowing that you were going to fail me in the midst of your failure. And guess what, Simon? I got kingdom work for you. I got a purpose for you. I think it's kind of cool that Jesus asked Simon, do you love me 3 times, to point back to his 3 denials, but he also told him 3 times, I want you to feed my sheep. And I think it's cool that it's like Jesus is saying to him, hey, your failure, I have purpose for you that's equal and greater to your failure. You denied me 3 times. I'm telling you, I got sheep and lambs that I need you to love and to lead 3 times plus some, right? Jesus is saying to Simon Peter in this conversation, I believe, Simon, I knew. I died for you anyway because I love you. And in the midst of your sin, I want you to rest in my love. Stop running, put down your shame shovel, and stop telling yourself that I'm so mad and disappointed, and I need you, Simon, to fulfill your purpose and feed my sheep. Here's what I know. As I'm standing up here in front of a room full of a bunch of Simons. I'm standing up here in front of a bunch of students and adults, and I know that sitting amongst this crowd, there are a whole bunch of Simons. And here's how I know, because I told you earlier, I'm just a youth minister. I'm not a Bible college professor. I can't even spell Bible college. Like, I work with students. And I love you guys. I take pride in the fact that I get to hang out with junior hires and high schoolers, and that's my job. Like, I dearly love working with you. And here's what I know. If you're like my kids, there are a bunch of you sitting out there that for a long time you've been holding a shame shovel so close to you and heaping shame on yourself and thinking that God is so disappointed and there's no way he could ever use me. And you've been running from him because of what you're caught up in and what you've been doing and how you've been acting and how you've been behaving, right? And you think, he must be so disappointed. There's no way he could ever use me and have a purpose for me, right? And here's the deal. It doesn't matter what you're caught up in. Simon Peter, it was like the worst. It doesn't matter if it's those friends you hang out with that have led you to do and say things that have dishonored God and you think that he's so mad and disappointed. It doesn't matter if it's that romantic relationship where you're pushing boundaries or he's pushing boundaries and you guys just succumb to some temptations. You think there's no way that I could ever recover from this. It doesn't matter if it's an addiction that you've struggled with for years and that you will struggle with for years. It doesn't matter if it's those images that you can't stop looking at and you may never stop looking at. It doesn't matter if you're like the worst person in the world when it comes to how you treat people and you're the gossiper and the slanderer and the bully and you use your words and your attitudes just shove. It does not matter what you're caught up in, where you've been, what you've done. Simon, the message for you tonight, Simon, I wish I knew all your names. I could sit here and like look you in the eye in a non-awkward, weird way and just use your name and say Madison, Taylor, Cooper, Carter, Jackson, and just look you in the face and tell you, like, here's the deal. Whatever it is that's got you squirming in your chairs right now because you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm getting called out here. I'm getting called to the carpet, as we prayed a little bit ago. Whatever it is, I need you to hear this, Simon. I need you to hear this. Simon, whatever it may be, he knew about it. Before you ever conceived that failure and sin, he knew about it. He is the God of the universe who created time and space. He exists outside of it. He gave us the sun and moon to govern time. And you don't think that he didn't know about your sin and your failure before it ever even happened? Just like he did Simon Peter's? So look at me, child. Whatever you're caught up in, whatever you've been hiding from the people sitting in your row, the people that you go to youth group with, the people that you came here with, whatever it may be, and I'm talking to the adults too, he knew about it beforehand. And you know what? He died for you anyway because he loves you. And he didn't need you to be the goodest little Christian girl in all the land And he didn't need you to be the goodest little Christian boy in all the land in order for you to earn his love. He didn't need you to overcome that sin and struggle that you have in your life in order for him to affirm you with his love. Scripture says in Romans 5:8, I think it's one of the most important verses in all Scripture, that God demonstrates his love for us in this, that he shows us the depth and the quality of his love in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So when you were up in it, he knew. Before you were ever born, he knew you were going to be a dirty, rotten, awful, stinky sinner just like me. And guess what? He died anyway because of his overwhelming, never-ending love for you. And here's what he wants for you. Holy cow, stop with the shame shovel. Like, put that thing down. Stop heaping the shame and guilt and listening to the wrong message from the enemy. Yes, the Holy Spirit will convict you of sin, but he will not tell you that your sin disqualifies you from God's love or having a purpose in him. If you're hearing that message, that comes from the enemy. And Jesus is saying, stop with the shame. Stop with the guilt. Rest from that. Rest from running from me. I'm pursuing you right now. I pursue you every day. I chase you, even though you leave the 99, right? We just sang it. He's saying, rest from running. Rest from the shame and guilt. Stop listening to the enemy and rest in my love. And do you know why? Because he has a purpose for you. He wants you to do kingdom work. He wants you to feed his sheep. And here's the thing. There are a lot of you tonight sitting in this chair that will hang on to your shame shovels and hang on to that lie that God is so mad at you and so disappointed, and you never pick up your cross and serve in the church and the kingdom because you're too busy telling yourself you're not good enough. You're not worthy enough. I've got to overcome these things before he can use me. And the message for you tonight, look at me. Look at the chubby old guy. Look at me. Wherever you sit, wherever the Holy Spirit's got you squirming with whatever you're dealing with, the message is he's not mad at you. And he doesn't need you to do anything to earn his love. Nothing you could ever do will ever make him love you more. Nothing you could ever do will make him love you less. He's not mad at you. So stop beating yourself up. Stop running away from him. Look at me. Rest in his love, because until you do, until you rest in that love and be transparent with a leader, an adult, or a small group leader, or a friend in your youth group, until you bring that sin and that struggle that you have into the light, as long as you cling to it in the darkness, you have a hard time picking up your cross, picking up that kingdom purpose, that kingdom work, and feeding his